And that's not just a strategic issue, that's a bureaucratic issue. You know, you're coming into a dispute, the first thing you want to do is sit back, look at the situation and say, before I try and figure out who did it, I need to figure out who is going to benefit if it succeeds. And that narrows it down very sharply. That narrows it. The only country to benefit from this exercise is Israel. Now,
Indeed.
there are people within the United States who could benefit from it. Certainly there were corporations, you know, your classic merchants of death, and the mercenary companies like the old Blackwater now. Is it pronounced XE or it's XE?
You know, I forget what they're calling themselves.
Yeah,
But,
it's capital X, lower letter E, and I don't know how they're pronouncing it. You know, I mean, the mercenary companies, forgive me, security contractors, how could I have been so gauche? The security contractors, the arms manufacturers, the construction companies, they're making a bundle on this.
Right.
So there are factions that do it. There are companies that do it. There can be individuals that benefit from it, but not countries.
Now
Not
let me stop you there, because according to the publicly uttered worldview of the neoconservatives of Project for a New American Century, they would claim that the U.S. would wildly, massively benefit from this new Pearl Harbor, which would allow the U.S. to do what they think the U.S. needed to do, which was to embark on a very extreme, aggressive imperial expansion phase.
Well, actually, their papers were a little bit different in the 1990s when they were writing them for the Israelis. I mean, openly for the Israelis as opposed to being in the U.S. government and doing the Israeli work. Mm-hmm. But the object of it was very clearly to use American military power and diplomatic leverage to crush Israel's enemies and to protect it from its internal and external security threats.
And so do you think that the claim that the U.S. empire, you know, the U.S. strategy needs a new Pearl Harbor and needs this kind of aggressive policy is really a mask to disguise the fact that it's Israel benefiting from this?
On the contrary, I think that the phrase they used, I believe, is a catalytic event.
Right.
That the catalytic event that they required and said before the first Bush administration, well, not the first, you know, this Bush administration, 2001, before it took office, was that it needed a catalytic event that without, I think it was phrased, without a catalytic event, you know, to mobilize public support for this, you know, this could be an extremely lengthy process. And of course, 9 months after coming into office, 8-9 months, they got their catalytic event. And I always love these wonderful coincidences. Right. But no, that's not I don't think this is a juxtaposition of an either or. The catalytic event was necessary to mobilize the United States first into not just an anti-Arab, but an anti-Islamic frenzy, and second, therefore, to underwrite the use of American military power to do these things which would directly benefit Israel. And the question that came to me from a couple of the people who heard my ugly truth interview said, well, what about the CIA or the Defense Department? And I replied, I said, you know, it's important to make a distinction between those departments and agencies and individuals or groups within them.
Right.
Now, the political appointees, a lot of the political appointees were the neocon alumni of PNAC. And they certainly were on the same sheet of music as the Israelis because their initial position papers were written for the Israelis. That's who they were. That's them. I mean, I know several of them personally from the 70s and the 80s. And I have no doubt whatsoever where their primary allegiance lies.
Right.
And
they sometimes actually come out and say it. Like you hear from, you know, I think Wolfowitz and Pearl have a couple of quotes where they, you know, talk about how, you know, when somebody says that they're going to exterminate you, you'd better believe them and, you know, take countermeasures and other references to the Holocaust that show that they're heavily motivated by this kind of loyalty to Zionism as a sort of a response to the Holocaust.
Sure, you know, and I understand that that's their argument. But when you get within the services, I mean, think of it. I mean, I suppose there may be some people within the CIA who lusted after the Afghan poppy fields. Although if they were lusting after drugs, and perhaps they already have done this, I would think that the cartels from Mexico through Colombia would be closer and easier. But within the military, even in the 80s when we were looking at the Soviets in Afghanistan, and the general sense was, and this was during the Cold War when most of us were looking at a conflict with the Soviet Union as not the most likely, but certainly the most dangerous. And most of us even felt a little sorry for the Soviets in Afghanistan. No one from Alexander the Great and probably before him, through the Romans, through the Persians, through the Parthians, even through the Mongols, through the British, and then the Soviets, no one had any joy out of Afghanistan. I can't think of a single American officer of any rank I knew in the 70s and 80s and early 90s who would have gotten up in the morning and said, by God, let's go to Afghanistan. It's not, it was, and Iraq wasn't on the line then. Iraq was not on the horizon in 2001.
Right.
And that's just not something they would drive for. So this isn't part of it. But when you look at the ones then that could have done it as an organization, Mossad, it is almost by default the only one left standing. And I think when people in the 9/11 truth movement and elsewhere, people who are listening to it and reading it but not active in it, ask, do their equivalent of, where's the beef, where's the proof? The evidence is there. The only piece of evidence lacking is a public confession by one of the architects of the operation. And that's not going to be forthcoming any more than public confessions by serial capital murders are common in criminal cases. It's not going to be there.
Well, the Israelis did finally admit that they did the Lavon affair.
Sure.
After 50 years of denials and calling people who said that anti-Semitic, they finally admitted it, and then they pinned medals on the people who did it.
Sure. And the same with the USS Liberty. They denied it, and finally they grudgingly acknowledged that it probably happened, and they honored the torpedo boat captain who put a torpedo into the ship.
Right.
It's part of their MO on this. But just looking at that. By default, they're the one left standing. But in the matter of,
it has to be done by an organization, though, Ellen. Could there have been some sort of, say, a private intelligence network based more on the American than the Israeli side? Webster Tarpley's rogue network.
Well, what I think happened on this is that for Mossad, as almost the only ones left standing, and in my analysis actually much more detailed, I'm trying to summarize, or sort of do topical sentences now. For Mossad to have been essentially the primary actor meant that they had to, given the target, us, that there had to have been approval for this for the length of time involved, the location, the people who owned and ran security for the World Trade Center. There had to have been approval at the highest levels of the Israeli government. How high, I don't know. Rabin apparently gave the order for the USS Liberty, and he was chief of staff at the IDF then. But it was at the very high levels. Had to have been. I can't. It's difficult for me to comprehend within what I know of the Israeli defense and intelligence system for that to have been done essentially as a rogue operation. But what they required was local support here, and that's not unusual. Covert ops require local support for action in a foreign country. And we even understood that in World War II. The classic Brits dropping in their special operations executive into occupied France and getting the Maquis as a local support base. There has to be something there. There has to be something there for access, to facilitate their access to the buildings. There has to be something there to facilitate their escape afterwards. And there has to be something there to conceal their actions.